Hello students, welcome back to our course on visual semantics for visual communication. In today's class, we will talk about visual composition. We have been talking about human communication as such, then we talked about human cooperative communication, we talked about visual perception, how do we perceive things around us, and then we slowly dealt with visual communication design as such, how it is formed and how it is being used. However, we did not really talk about what creates visual composition or how visual communication design is done. Many of you might be aware how visual communication or visual composition is done. We all use that, or we are all we have practiced that since our childhood. I will just show you an example where you will understand that we all have been attuned to doing visual communication, maybe knowingly or unknowingly, and it consists of certain principles or elements based on which visual composition is done. So, basically when we talk about visual composition, there are two things we have to keep in mind. So, visual composition has two distinct parts. One part is the elements of composition and the other is various principles of composition. So, why are we talking about various elements and various principles of composition? Because a composition, as it is understood by its definition, is an arrangement of various things. A composition is architecturing or arrangement or organizing different things or entities in one place, so that essentially consists of certain elements. There are certain elements which are involved, there are certain elements which come together and builds a composition, and not only that, these elements come together in a particular fashion or by a certain kind of order, and these orders or principles also need to be known when we are talking about visual composition. So, in today's lecture, we will focus on two aspects of visual composition, that is the elements of visual composition and the principles of visual composition. Any visual communication design, any visual composition around us abide by these two aspects. What we are looking all around consists of elements which form the composition and consists of order or certain principles coming in place for us to visually perceive and visual communication to happen with us. Now, let us look at the elements first. So, if we look at some of the elements, the first element we talk about is point. So, any visual entity starts with a point. It is the indication of a visual entity in space. Without a point or a entity which we can refer to, so basically this is a reference we talk about. So, to start with, a point is a reference in space. So, a reference in space that we start with. Without point, we really do not go forward to any of the elements. So, the first element we talk about is a point, and for visual communication's sake, a point means a lot. A point, say I draw a point here, I draw a point here, immediately you start relating these two points by a line, or say I draw points which are in close proximity and I draw points which are in distance, they create some kind of communication through the arrangement of these points. We will talk about these arrangements later, which we talked about the ordering of this point come into the domain of principles. However, you can see that using points we are trying to achieve a communication, or by using points we are trying to do certain kind of visual composition which relates or which means something to us, whatever be the case, but points are an essential and primary element for visual composition. We need to understand that. So, in most of my classes when I talk about visual composition, I start with a drawing which all of us have done in our childhood. So, I ask people to draw a scenery or to draw a very basic drawing which you must have drawn when you were very young. So, let us see one of those drawings what we do when we are very young. So, young people tend to draw a house, or they are taught to draw a house, that is a window. You draw some mountains behind, you will draw a pathway like this, and you might draw a tree like this, and there could be many more things as ice, or there could be a water running down, a stream flowing by the mountain, and many people might do many other sort of beautification in that particular painting. You many a times draw a sun like this, a sun peeping through, and certain birds. So, this is a very basic sketch which as a child, or if you ask any of the children to draw a sketch or a scenery or make a conceptualization of space, they would draw a similar sort of a drawing. Now, I use this drawing to explain many of the elements and principles of visual composition and visual communication, because as a child you have very basic understanding of visual composition, you have a very basic understanding of the visual understanding of the world, and hence you are representing that in some kind of visual representation. So, that captures some of the very core elements and principles which we are going to discuss in this class. So, the first element we talked about is point and the importance of point. As you understand, this particular drawing is made out of innumerous points coming into picture, and that together forms this particular visual representation. Now, coming to the next element is the line, or I will use rather another paper to explain. So, the other element which comes into picture is the line. So, a line could be of various forms, as you understand. There could be straight line, there could be curved lines, there could be slanted line, vertical lines, horizontal lines, diagonal lines, and as well as there could be something which is referred to as broken lines, or lines having certain amount of textural quality. So, there could be various dimensions to a line, there could be various ways of drawing a line, but the second element of visual composition which we talk about is line, and line forms many of the other things. It is one of the primary primitive that is being used for visual composition. So, if we go back to our house painting again, if we look at this particular painting again, we will see that this particular drawing is made by various lines. So, various lines have been used, either straight line or curved line or broken line. Many of those things have been used for creating this particular drawing. So, the next very important element for visual composition is line, which comes into picture. So, we use lines all the time for making this kind of visual representation. Now comes the next important element which we would talk about, which is formed out of line, is shape or form. So, the another element which comes into picture is shape or form, and the lines start forming shapes. So, various lines together start forming various shapes. So, our circle is essentially made out of a curved line. There could be polygons which are formed out of straight lines. There could be a combination of curved line and straight line. There could be amoeboidal shape formed by irregular curves, and there could be regularness. So, there could be regularness of shape and there could be irregularness of shape and form. So, there could be various types of shapes which could be made out of lines. There could be different dimensions to it, different aspects to shape, and there could be open shape and closed ones. So, these are examples of closed shapes. Many a times a shape could be open as well. So, this is a particular shape which is open to some extent, but gives a sense of enclosure. This gives a sense of shape, but at the same time it gives a sense of space within it. So, we will discuss space a little later, but this is one aspect we should understand, that shapes and forms are being formed, and forms add to a three-dimensionality to a particular shape. So, whenever we talk about form are many a times referred to as shapes having a three-dimensionality to it. So, there is a sense of 3 dimension to a 2 dimension. So, that creates shape and form. So, if we again refer back to our this particular image, we will see that there are various shapes that has been used. So, in this particular case a triangle has been used, or a square has been used, or a irregular, amoeboidal or curvilinear shape has been used, and there are various open shapes also which are used. So, this is an open shape, but gives a sense of gives a sense of a shape and gives a sense of space. So, all of these together creates shape and form coming together to create a visual composition. So, this is another very important aspect we should know. And coming to the next element which I was referring to is space. So, apart from the shapes, line and point, what is important for us to understand, that space in a composition is equally important as the object in itself. So, for example, many a times we talk about visual clutter or a composition being chaotic, or there are too many things in a visual composition that destroys the communication capability. So, we talked about one very essential characteristic or feature of information in one of the last classes, where we talked about information is meant to be unambiguous. It reduces uncertainty. So, when things are not certain, you are adding on to the noise, you are adding on to uncertainty, it actually creates a breach in communication. So, in other words, in terms of visual composition, space acts as a very, very important element, where you really do not fill up the entire space in your composition with elements, with shapes, lines, color, points. You do not fill up the entire space, you allow certain amount of space to be left out, so that there is unambiguity and there is direct information communication happening with it. So, if we look at this particular drawing again, you must be noticing that this particular space is our arena of composition. You would seldom find a child filling up all of these places. Many a times another child may add a flower, which is another very important element which we tend to see in compositions. So, if you look at this composition now, you will find that there are lot of space being left out. There have lines be there are usage of lines, there are usage of shapes, there are usage of various elements of visual composition coming together, including these, but there is lot of space also. So, this in many a times in terms of composition referred to as positive and negative spaces. So, positive spaces, or many a time we refer to it as figure and ground. So, we refer to as figure and ground. So, basically the shapes, the lines, the color, the contrast, we will talk about all of that a little later, but all of these forms the figure aspect of this particular composition. So, they are forming the figure aspect of this particular composition, and ground is the base where the figures are being used and lot of space have been left out for the composition to take place, and more essentially for a proper unambiguous visual communication to take place in this particular composition. So, now we talk about another very important aspect of visual composition, which is related to the quality of surface and quality of light reflectance by the object. So, we term that element as texture or pattern. Many a time they are used synonymously, though there is a difference between them. So, texture and pattern predominantly relate to the visual characteristic or the characteristic of the surface, the tonal characteristic, or in other words the characteristic of the surface which is dependent on quality of light being reflected from that surface. So, as you are aware of texture being used colloquially, texture, we talk about smooth texture, we talk about rough texture. What it essentially means in terms of visual terms is a smooth texture is where the light is reflecting uniformly, and that creates an impression of smoothness, whereas the light reflecting on a surface and is not reflected in a regular fashion, that creates a sense of irregularity or more texturedness of a surface. So, this refers to the textural quality of a surface, whereas pattern refers to usage of lines and shapes in close proximity, which gives you a feeling of a surface of a different nature. So, patterns are many a times used as a repetition of the same shape or same lines, or a combination of line and shape together, or a combination of shapes together. So, you keep on repeating that so that a pattern is created, but the pattern essentially adds on to this textural quality of a visual. So, hope that is clear to you. So, let us again refer back to our base image. So, if you look at this particular roof, I have used a particular series of lines. The reason for doing this is to create a particular textural quality. So, you may refer to as a pattern because there is a repetition of lines in a particular manner. So, that creates a pattern, but overall it adds on to the textural quality of this particular image. So, this is the idea of texture when we talk about in terms of visuals. So, that lets us understand many of the qualities or many of the elements we talk about when we refer to elements of visual composition. Now, we will refer to one very key element for visual composition, which is lacking in this particular drawing. Can you, if you can look at that, this particular drawing has been done, but does it lack something? Is this drawing looking very dissimilar from the drawing you have made when you were a child? Yes, it is, because of one factor that we will discuss now is based on color. So, color is also a very, very important aspect of visual communication, and color in terms of visual language, we distinguish it by three specific terminology: the hue, value and saturation. Initially it might sound a little difficult to understand, or these are not commonly practiced terms. We use color in general, but within a color three important factors are playing a role. One is the hue, then the second is the value, and the third is the saturation. So, I will explain that concept through Munsell color system, where you can look at Munsell developed the scheme of color, which actually explains what hue, value and saturation is. So, essentially if you look at this particular ring represents the hue. The hue is nothing but what we colloquially term as color. So, these are different names to a color. You can see there is red, there is yellow, there is green, there is blue, and then there are combination of these colors forming other colors. So, which are called primary colors, then you get secondary colors, and then you get tertiary colors. So, with all sort of combination you get enormous number or values of distinguishable colors by human eye. So, that particular aspect of visual composition is referred to as hue. So, hue is something which is running horizontally. However, there is another aspect to hue is value. The next one which we talk about is the value, and as you can see the value is ranging from 0 to 10, or in other words 0 represents the amount of light being present or the amount of blackness or darkness that the color possesses, and the white represents the highest value where the highest amount of light is present in this particular value, and there could be other ranges of values in between. So, in other words, the hue ring that you see here, if it would travel lower, it would get darkened. So, the same blue for that matter, if it goes down the value or the value is lesser, it will become darker blue and darkest blue, whereas if the value of the blue gets higher, it will become lighter blue and the lightest blue, and ultimately it will become white at the absolute situation. So, I hope the concept of hue and value is clear to you. That creates the enormous domain of different possible colors which we colloquially refer to. So, huge number of colors could be formed based on the color that you are referring to. So, there you might be referring to red, but the red can range between now in all through these values. So, ranging from black to a very dark red to red to lighter red, very light red, and ultimately leading into a white value. So, the value of red keeps on changing based on a vertical scale. So, one more important aspect related to color is being left out, which is the saturation, or many a time it is referred to as chroma as well. So, that refers to as the intensity of the color or the intensity of the amount of hue present in that. So, that ranges, you can see in this diagram, as it reaches towards the core of the value, it turns grayish, it loses its intensity and loses its color, whereas if it ranges out, it gets saturated. So, the saturation is also a very important aspect of color, and so now you can understand that these three aspects of color in general forms the notion of color. So, color in terms of visual composition, color in terms of visual communication relies on these three factors. One is the hue, the second is the value, and the third is the saturation. So, all of these together forms the color concept of a particular visual composition. So, if we look at this image right now, this lacks any of this color aspect to it. However, different color could be used for creating a different mode of visual communication to this image. And not only that, so I am using a particular hue, I can use different value to it, I can use different saturation to it. So, as you can understand, as you can see, what I am doing is the saturation in this region is growing. If I would add a little bit of darker value to it, the value is becoming darkened. So, I am right now representing it in a very crude form, just to make you understand how the color, hue, value and saturation together makes a difference in the visual composition. So, you can well imagine when there would be different hues coming into this image with different values, with different saturation, this particular composition would look very differently and would communicate in a very different manner from what it is doing now. So, we now will move on to the principles of visual communication in our next lecture, but in this lecture, if we reiterate again what we learnt about various elements of visual communication or visual composition, is the importance of points, lines, forms or shapes, various textures and patterns and color, which together they come together as elements in different composition to create a visual composition. Or in other words, whenever we are also experiencing any sort of visual composition, it is broken down into various shapes and its representation will also be broken down into various shapes or various elements as we have discussed. Say for example, when as a child you would visit a zoo or see an animal and try to represent it, you look at an animal as an entity in nature. That does not come in terms of a package of lines, forms, shapes, colors, textures and all that. You look at an animal as an entity, as a whole, prevalent in nature. Same has been the situation. Think about thousands and thousands years back, when the first caveman started his drawing on the walls of a cave. Before that, no one ever has scratched a single stone on the walls of a cave to represent an animal. The notion, the thinking has always been the same. So, you are trying to depict or represent, you are trying to encode an information which is prevalent in nature. You have observed that information, you have observed, and based on that you have received that information, then you have processed it, you perceived it, and you start sketching or representing it. And while you are doing that, what all are the things that you are using? You are using lines, you are using points, you are using different shapes, you are using texture, you are using patterns many a times, and you are using colors. So, all of these elements coming together forms the visual composition. So, you are basically breaking down whatever you are perceiving into some form of visual elements which we discussed, and then while representing, you are actually trying to again encode this into some kind of elemental arrangement in order to represent that. This would be more clear or clearer when we discuss about principles of visual communication design in the next lecture. Thank you very much.